you to know that she is our board president for TUNDI Productions, our company, and you know, I love you so much, I admire you so much, and this is going to be great. Thank you, Sophie, for being here.
Thank you. There's nothing like having two Brits on the stage that everybody starts getting embarrassed. Anyway, today, last week I spoke a little bit about magic and popular culture. And today I get to talk about the end of the world, which I've been looking forward to. I have to say, not the end of the world, I might add, but well, I've been looking forward to seeing Gotterdammerung. And I'm sure many of you sitting here now, that's what you're going to be doing in a few hours. And I've also been looking forward for some time to getting to this point so I can talk about endings. And I'm a little late for a very specific reason that I'll come back to at the end of the lecture. So, doomsday, here we are. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It's 90 seconds to midnight. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Growing up in the UK, when I was 5, I thought the world would be invaded by Daleks and would end. Anybody know what a Dalek is? Yes? We have some Doctor Who fans in the room. Oh, you need me on the microphone, thank you. So when I was 5, I thought the world was going to end by being invaded by Daleks. They were going to come down my local streets and exterminate them all. Us all. Then I heard over the media, when I was really, really young, about the nuclear bomb. I believed that the end of the world was about to occur any minute. We had Dr. No, the movie. We had portrayals of nuclear destruction. We had John Wayne potentially dying of radiation poisoning. And I remember, as an English person, and I'm sure everybody had their own version of this, a wonderful cartoon animated film by the British author Raymond Briggs called When the Wind Blows, which took aim at government nuclear attack materials. In the cartoon, an elderly couple, they're about to be hit by a nuclear bomb, and they're desperately trying to follow the government leaflets on what to do. You know, tape up your window, get under a table, right? I think children in America were told to form the crash position, right? So we all grew up, or many of us in this room grew up with those stories. Then I heard about the threat of robots. Robots were about to take over our world and wipe us all out. That may sound faintly ridiculous in the imaginings of a 10-year-old, but on the other hand, only a decade later we had Terminator, robots driven by AI, and now we just have AI, which is about to end the world any minute now. The end of the days has war, it has earthquakes, it has famines, it has robot strikes and plague, and it always has, though I'm not quite sure about the robots. For instance, the end of the world was supposed to have come in the 14th century, and it's not surprising that people in Latin Western Europe would imagine the end of the world was about to occur when 2/3 of them died over a series of decades. We look for the discovery of black holes, we look for comets, we look for number symbolism, and those comets are going to hit Earth and blow us all up. And now we have climate change, which, by the way, could cause many of those things all on its own. We have a history of ends of the world. Indeed, just doing a quick kind of like broad sweep of the different prophecies that have occurred, dates for the end of the world between 1000 AD and today, only of Europe and the Middle East and some America, there are 180 dates that have been predicted for the end of the world in that time, and those are only the ones that we know about. In the year 1999, we were not quite sure, but the year 2000, do you all remember that? Was not looking so good. And we had potentially the massive breakdown of world order, and then the clock struck and all the computers still worked. I think many people, though, were out there buying canned soup and making sort of shelters, etc. 2012 was supposedly the end, as predicted apparently by the Mayan long count calendar, which is a bit dubious that it ever did, based on the idea that we have cycles of history, and the 13th cycle ended on December 21st, 2012. And the world would come crashing to an end. But crucially, some believe this wouldn't mark the end of the world, but potentially simply a resetting of the cycle. Either way, it was an open question, because some of these things are the end of the world, but what does that even mean? Crucially, an ending can mean a lot of different things, from the return to the void, nothingness, from which God will remake us, to the movement to no physical life or matter, as we all experience the rapture and are taken up to either heaven or hell, to the universe reaching its limit after the Big Bang, expanding out and then suddenly retracting back into another Big Bang, to the end of our planet or the solar system, to the end of humankind's journey on Earth, to, in fact, our own personal ending. Because we live with so many predictions and stories of endings, but they are all essentially different. We have stories that are localized. We have stories that run in the family, stories of how people die. We have stories that are related to particular sects, to a region, to an ethnic group, or a whole worldwide religion. After all, isn't that what Christianity in many respects is based on? Christian endings are filled with the imperative to convert or repent. Jesus said he was coming back, and he was coming back in the lifetime of the apostles. And by doing so, he was promulgating a Jewish Messiah myth, which still exists, of course, and is still there in terms of the end of the world. But the apostles in the early in the early days of Christianity fundamentally believed that the end of the world was occurring at any minute and we needed to get ready. So in many respects, the entire Christian religion is based on that notion, based on endings. So then what happens when it doesn't happen? Well, first of all, it gets put off. We've got all those dates that happen later. And if the purpose that you created your religion for disappears, there is no ending in sight, then actually experience shows that what you do is expand and find a new vision, preferably with a little bit of endings in the world here and there to motivate people. For instance, when we think of the last great splinter in the Christian church, the Protestant Reformation, Luther himself prophesied the end of the world, and it was supposed to have occurred in 1600. There's nothing like a little bit of an ending to spice everybody towards following the right path. So we have this cycle, creation and destruction, the beginning and the end, the alpha and omega. And both, I would argue, are actually wrapped up in each other, because every creation assumes a destruction, and a destruction apparently in many ways assumes a creation. Die Gotterdammerung, and I do apologize for my German, which is non-existent, is our omega, sometimes known as the twilight of the gods, or the fate of the gods, otherwise known as Ragnarok, or Aldarok, the fate of humankind. There's a burning, there's an immersion in water, and there's a renewal of the world. But when we look at Gotterdammerung, it's rather different to the actual story of Ragnarok. For instance, in Ragnarok, the fates weave the ending of the world. It is part of what is fated. There will be this ending. Whereas in Die Gotterdammerung, the weave breaks. There is no more fate. This is very different to the stories of Ragnarok. Why? Why is that occurring? Why does fate suddenly end? With the breaking, the fates can no longer see, they can no longer know. The supernatural world, the mythical world, is suddenly blind. We are moving forward without a predetermined fate. The focus, therefore, must move from the other world to this world. Indeed, the main action of Gotterdammerung is in the middle, in Midgard, between the underworld and Valhalla. We find out also that Wotan's spear, the law holding everything together, has broken. Why? The order that arguably underlies the universe, all the worlds, has been broken. The order of the gods has ended. The structure of the universe based on magical thinking, which is where I began last week, the unseen world of fate and gods providing order for humankind and for the whole universe has ended. He's also put branches of the world around Valhalla. What does that mean? He's preparing his own bonfire. Wotan is preparing for the ending. The ending itself, the burning of Valhalla, the gods and the heroes they are holding captive in death as a slave army all die. So the bondage of humanity is done. And then are we apparently redeemed through love at the end of Götterdämmerung, which seems to be almost the suggestion of the music? Or have we seen a tale of redemption? Or what was that? It's all very confusing. What is this ending? Well, why are we interested in endings? Well, many people have argued it's an existential anxiety, which I think we can all relate to. We're all afraid of death. There's a marvelous book that was written in the 1960s that I want to refer to here because it's something that got me thinking about endings. It's called The Sense of an Ending by Frank Kermode. And in it, he argues that, indeed, that the human condition is to blame. By the way, I would admit that this is a very psychologizing approach to the question, and so it's just one approach. He says we're only here for a short while, therefore we need a pattern, we need a story. We have begun, we are now in the middle, we will end. And that relationship between beginning, middle, and end needs, therefore, to be in harmony. There needs to be a process of cause and effect. We need to be able to make our own story, a story that it has its own causality and that then expands into a narrative where everything has a beginning, a middle, and the end. In many respects, by the way, this point of view is a teleological point of view from the Greek, meaning in the end. So it's all about thinking about things in terms of endings. But there's another fancy word which we relate to all of this, which is eschatological thinking. That is thinking about apocalypses and ending as apocalypse. Life is teleological, but is it eschatological? Is it about endings, or is it about the blowing up of everything? Kermode argues we are in the middle, often in a decadence. Things have got bad, where everything is at the nadir, and we need to reform or change. We need the new. Or sometimes we're in the middle of a forest of the world, and we need to find the way out, get back to the pathway we lost when we entered the woods. So it is a time when we either need a crisis, the wake-up call, that says, oh, look, I got lost, now I need to find my pathway out. Or both, we need an ending. Consequently, those in the middle think teleologically and also often eschatologically. Crisis and ending. Each new generation must be the ones to undergo the change and is responsible for making the new world. And you think about it, that's something that we still very much relate to today. If we think about climate change and Generation Z and the whole conversation between generations about how you've spoilt the world and what are we going to do about it. It seems to be, Kermode says, a condition attaching to the exercise of thinking about the future, that one should assume one's own time to stand in extraordinary relation to it, as if we're something special and this is a special moment. Men in the midst are also prone, he says, to make predictions about the date on which the world will end. Indeed, some people do approach apocalyptic fictions with a naive acceptance. Others have a clerkly skepticism and deny that it is possible to accurately predict the world's end date. You can see this, for instance, in Greek mythology, which continues through. Even now, we have this idea, the Hellenic idea of the Golden Age, which is followed by the Silver Age. We, by the way, are living in the Bronze Age, the kind of like the bad place, where all the fun stuff has disappeared and all the good stuff has disappeared, and while we are responsible for doing something about it, or simply we will move on to apocalypse. So the middle is the age we now live and is characterized by decadence, where what was good has declined and needs now to renovate. In order to usher in the new age, a process of painful purging or terrors needs to be undergone. People living in the middle typically believe that the end is very near and that their own generation will be responsible for the next stage. So we have the stories of the flood, We have stories which, of course, we all know from Noah, but those stories are all over the world. We have immolation, the world burning. I've got a little example of one. I've got a few apocalypses to share with you. But it's not very long, but this is William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the end of 6,000 years is true, as I have heard, he says provocatively, from hell. For the cherub with his flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at tree of life, and when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas it now appears finite and corrupt. He says, by the way, that this will come to pass by an improvement of sensual pleasure, which I have to say I think we can all get behind. When that happens, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would then appear to man as it is, which is infinite. This also can occur spatially, and I want to give you a few examples of that spatial dimension of beginning, middle, and end. We see it, of course, first of all, seeing as we're talking about Die Götterdämmerung in Norse legend. So we have Asgard, where Valhalla is. We have Midgard, which is our world. And then Norse legend does love a good underworld. So there are three of them. And here I have to admit I do not speak Norwegian or any type of Icelandic either. So we have Svartalfheim, we have Niederwelle, and we have Elheim. So we have hell, we have the area where the Nibelungs are, and then Svartalfheim is where the ice giants hang out. So we actually had all three, we had at least two of those hells represented last night in Das Rheingold. It also, we've seen this in other poems, and I want to give you a few more quotes, if I may, under here. One of my favorite poems connected with this idea of middles and endings, which is called Piers the Ploughman, which is a medieval text from England. And the poet begins, it's a dream poem. One summer season when the sun was warm, I rigged myself out in shaggy wooden clothes, as if I were a shepherd. And in the garb of an easy-living hermit, I set out to roam far and wide through the world, hoping to hear of marvels. But on a morning in May, among the Malvern Hills, a strange thing happened to me as through by magic. For I was tired out by my wanderings, and I lay down to rest under a broad bank by the side of a stream. And I leaned over, gazing into the water. It sounded so pleasant that I fell asleep, and I dreamt a marvelous dream. I was in a wilderness. I could not tell where, and looking eastwards, I saw a tower high up against the sun and splendidly built on top of a hill. And far beneath it, it was a great gulf with a dungeon in it, surrounded by deep, dark pits, dreadful to see. But between the tower and the gulf, I saw a smooth plain, thronged with all kinds of people, high and low together, moving busily about their worldly affairs. And then my final example of that spatial mid-point to the beginning and end is, of course, another famous beginning of a poem, which is Dante's Inferno. So the beginning of Dante, he starts, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say what was this forest, savage, rough, and stern, which in the very thought renews the fear. So bitter is it, death is little more, but of the good to treat which there I found, speak will I of the other things I saw there. I cannot well repeat how there I entered, he's forgotten. So full was I of slumber at the moment. This is a trope where people fall asleep into these situations in which I had abandoned the true way. But after I had reached the mountain's foot, at that point where the valley terminated, which had with consternation pierced my heart, upward I looked, and I beheld its shoulders, vested already with that planet's rays, which leadeth others right by every road. So the sun is shining over the mountain he needs to climb, and he's fallen asleep and he's found himself in this dark forest. Then was the fear a little quieted that in my heart's lake had endured throughout the night which I had passed so piteously. And even as he who with distressed breath forth-issued from the sea upon the shore turns to the water perilous and gazes, so did my soul that still was fleeing onward turn itself back to re-behold the past which never yet a living person left. After my weary body had rested, the way resumed I on the desert slope, so that the firm foot ever was the lower. And lo, almost where the ascent began, a panther, light and swift exceedingly, which with a spotted skin was covered over, and never moved she from before my face. Nay, rather did she impede so much my way, that many times I to return had turned. And in this way, Dante is refused the path up the mountain, which is the mountain of delectation, the mountain of paradise. Instead, he has to turn on another way on his journey, which is the descent into the inferno, because Dante can only come to paradise through the terrors and the crisis of inferno and then purgatory. From the middle of life and the middle of the path, but in a forest and confronted by a panther that he cannot get around, he needs to journey to hell. But is the ring cycle one of Commode's such stories? And this is really causing me some concern, because these stories are based on inevitability, on causality, beginning, middle, end. There is a right path, you're going to lose it, but if you stop and you think you are going to either achieve terror and crisis and cataclysm, or maybe you will get through it and get to some sort of redemption. But is the ring cycle that story? Because the fate web has been broken, and the spear of order has been broken, which means there is no cause and effect. So what happens to the narrative of the story? It's clearly not quite so simple. There are indeed lots of other endings, which are not endings per se, because there's different ways of seeing history and narrative. They can be returns or allow for a life in this world. For instance, we can return to the Golden Age, and it doesn't have to be after death, though I would still argue that is part of a particular cyclical narrative. For example, there are different periods in history where you see the emergence of different ideas of endings, what is going to happen at the end and what might happen afterwards as well. In the 15th and 16th century, it's kind of famous for the development of the notion of the utopia. Of course, most famously with Sir Thomas More's Utopia, but, followed very quickly after by Campanella's City of the Sun. And I could argue, by the way, that the New Jerusalems of various periods before that are also associated with that type of utopia. In fact, if you think sociologically, it's so interesting how the notion of a place that you can reach where there is redemption and there is rebirth and there is not cataclysmic ending moves from a place that is outside of this world to a place that is the New Jerusalem in this world. For example, Savonarola, the Dominican monk who took over Florence at the end of the 15th century, preached that Florence would become the New Jerusalem and the new Rome, which of course made it highly political as an idea. But utopia in the 16th century becomes literally, because that's what the words mean, no place or well place, both at the same time. And then, of course, once we can imagine a place that's no place, where everything is wonderful, but after the maps have been settled and there is no more place to explore, what happens to utopia? So we see in the 17th and 18th centuries and beyond, utopia moves off-world, farther and further and further away, because anywhere that we can reach and actually exist is clearly not utopia. Another version of history that became really important is one we might talk about as the modernist version of history. And that is the concept that the arc of history moves towards progress. That, for example, the example I always love to give for modernist versions of history is the diagram that you often see where you have the, hang on, I'm going to move away from the microphone here for a second, where you have the chimpanzee that gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you have the man striding forward. That is the concept of progression, the idea that the narrative arc of the story is moving towards betterment, is actually moving, is not the golden age that goes down to the nadir of, say, of the medieval world and the Renaissance world, but an idea of history and of narrative about getting better and better. In that case, endings cannot be cataclysmic, per se. But something went wrong with modernism, because in the 20th century, if we move on from utopia, we have the emergence of dystopia. The first dystopian novel was Moi, or We, by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which kind of portrays this idea of a terrible future, not an apocalypse, it's not eschatological, but it's an ending of dystopian, it's a dystopian vision of the future. Dystopias are all around us. Whether we're turning on the TV and we're watching Walking with the Living Dead. Okay, this is something I've never seen. By the way, I hate post-apocalyptic stories. There's something about them that I just find so gloomy, from Omega Man to whatever that is called, to The Road by Cormac McCarthy. These are all post-apocalyptic stories, the Mad Max. Endings have occurred, but then where is the rebirth? Where is the optimism? What is that called? Walking with the Living Dead? Thank you, Walking Dead, right. Anyway, there are zombies involved, so my husband loves that, but yeah. So we have this emergence of dystopias, which are still really very much around, where endings are followed by something, but the something is absolutely miserable. Though I guess if you're an alpha male, it's not too bad. Just saying. And then following the dystopian period, you've got that sort of postmodernist narrative, the kind of the after or during modernist idea of the rhizomal narrative. That's taking from the notion of the tulip bulb or the rhizome, where there is the root is such that there is no beginning or end to the root. It just keeps going round and round on a tulip bulb. So theorists took that notion from the bulb. And they call a rhizomal narrative something that has no beginning, no ending, just the middle. And so we're constantly in this loop of middle. Commode himself, I think, may go a little bit more towards the dystopian. He argues that we have moved from Christian eschatology, or the idea of the apocalypse, to a more individualized notion of the end of the world. As he famously said, the end of the world is no longer imminent, it's immanent. It's right here all the time. It is always with us. But I've been hinting also at this notion of cycles, and I've said it before with creation and destruction. So we also have the cyclical view of history, where beginnings and endings just keep happening. It's existed for thousands of years too. Many of the great world religions are based on cyclical endings, beginnings and endings, periods of creation and destruction, so that we can be in the middle of something towards an ending, but it is part of a recurrence. We are in the middle of one phase. And my final little bit of snippet of poetry, I think we all deserve some T.S. Eliot. So who loves cyclical history? So let me see. What we call the beginning is often the ending, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from, and every phrase and sentence that is right, where every word is at home, taking its place to support the others, the word neither diffident nor ostentatious, an easy commerce of the old and the new, the common word exact without vulgarity, the formal word precise but not pedantic, the complete consort dancing together. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning, every poem an epitaph, and every action is a step to the block, to the fire, down the sea's throat, or to an illegible stone. And that is where we start. We die with the dying. See, they depart, and we go with them. We are born with the dead. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. So while the light falls on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now, and England. Hey, I just had to leave that last sentence in. So even Ragnarok is the same. You know, they have this massive story of destruction and apocalypse, a very eschatological story. But there is another version of Ragnarok where Vali, the gods Vali, Baldur, Hodra, and Thor's sons Modi and Magni, they all survive the destruction of the old gods, and they live very happily ever after. There is also a man and a woman, Lith and Lithrazir, which is from apparently the Old Norse, life and striving after life. They've hidden themselves in a place called the Wood of Hodmimir, and come out and they repopulate the world. Just like in the ancient, I think 3,500 year BC Sumerian epic, the Gilgamesh cycle, where the first Noah, Utnapishtim, survives the flood and is able to repopulate the earth. So this story of recurrence is there throughout. And even St. John the Divine, the Apocalypse of St. John, I talked about Christianity being based on this idea of imminent destruction. But when you look at the Apocalypse of St. John the Divine, it is actually about phases of destruction. It's not about the end of the world. Or I can tell you, if it's the end of the world, it's taking a really, really long time, and it keeps going backwards and forwards. In many respects, if you read it as a series of waves and phases that may eventually be the end of the world, then that is potentially a more kind of a more clarity-driven idea of what is going on in that text. And then finally, I'd be very remiss, and when I talk about history and the notion of cycles, not to refer to Nietzsche, because after all, there is a famous relationship there with Wagner. So what is Nietzsche's idea of eternal return? Because that's what he calls this, his cyclical idea of history. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche famously talks about the idea of eternal return and the fact that God is dead, both of which might want to resonate with us for a second as we look at Die Götterdämmerung. So I will come back to that. The idea of eternal recurrence is that things are just going to keep going on and on and on, round and round and round. So you better live in the moment, and you must affirm your will to live in the moment, because you have to affirm every moment, your will to affirm every moment, because every moment will keep coming back at you. So we have to live our lives that way. So we understand that Götterdämmerung, and indeed the whole ring cycle, is teleological. It is a movement from beginning to end, but it is also cyclical, the ring. It just keeps going round. The gold returns to the Rhine maidens. But is it eschatological? Only apparently for the gods and heroes. The other world, the world of divinity and the semi-divine, or heroes. The order of the gods has been broken, the apocalypse foretold has come, and it is a Ragnarok-style event. And the fate web has broken. There is no more fate. But it does not look like the end of the world. Midgard and the humans still stand at the end of the cycle. We could say it's a new phase of history, which is about to begin. But I'm not even sure about that. Without fate, how can we even talk about phases of history? How can we talk about moving on to the next story Fate's gone. How can we talk about narratives? There is no beginning, middle, or end. How can we talk about stories? And here we return to Nietzsche and the death of God. Is that what Wagner is giving us? He's giving us that idea that every moment must be lived. You know what? I don't think it's quite that either. We often think of Wagner as being part of what academics like me might fancily call second stage modernism. Sorry for bopping that one in on you. And that is a kind of like a notion of romanticism, German romanticism, that's associated with the idea of folk. It's associated with the birth of nationalism and of rules, or as Benedict Anderson calls them in a rather memorable phrase, imaginary communities. That's the nation as an imaginary community. But by 1876, when he first performed Die große Dämmerung, we're drawing near the end of the century, and a whole new wave that will finally become, wait for it, third wave modernism. We come up with some fancy names. That's the modernism, by the way, that gives us dystopias. So it leads to Aldous Huxley, it leads to 1984, it leads to Zemyatin's Mui. It then eventually, that also leads to postmodernism. And Nietzsche, ironically, is considered one of the founding fathers of postmodernism. So if we in any way connect Wagner's thought on endings to Nietzsche and the death of God and eternal recurrence, then we also have to bring in that postmodern context. So that is the home, postmodernism, of the narrative that is in the middle of everything, where we have lost narrative completely. So I could get academic here for a minute, and I guess I already have for the past few minutes, and talk about Wagner as being suspended in the middle of all those dynamics. That Götterdämmerung displays the lost world of epic, lost to modernism because of that emphasis on beginning, middle, and end. It's also displaying second wave modernism, that romanticism. It's displaying end of century angst through that determination of endings and that movement towards something that may be dystopian. And it's also showing us some third wave modernism for the lack of resolution but continuing existence at the end, the sense of combining all potential endings, and also that postmodern freedom from narrative because of the breaking of the fate web and because the spear of treaties and law has been broken. This is mirrored, obviously, then, the freedom from narrative is mirrored in the removal of fate, the removal of gods. There is no more otherworldly guidance or dominance. We are left with a life, potentially, maybe, for people to live using their own free will. We may be in a place where there are no more phases of history, no more cycles, no more sense of progress, no return to the golden age, no more stories. But also, and let us not forget this, in an opera whose story we know, one that moves right from the beginning, right from the alpha, inexorably, inevitably, terrifyingly, to death, destruction, and the potential for renewal. It is already fated. It has already happened. The Norns may break the fate web, but the fate web of the ring cycle remains. The spear of the treaty of law remains. We will lose everything. We know we will lose everybody we have loved, connected with, and fought for, and fought with during this cycle of operas. I don't know how we can bracket Götterdämmerung, and this is where you come in. As we step into the last days, as we experience in just over an hour and 20 minutes, betrayal, deceit, poison, and the death of the gods, as we experience the crashing, tragic inevitability of Siegfried's death, Brunhilde's death, the death of love itself, with what must feel like that ironic nod to redemption at the end, we must be aware there is no ending. The cast and the orchestra will give you one, and the cycle will end, but... And I've been thinking a lot about this, which is why I was slightly late today. How am I going to end this lecture? You know, as an academic, I would like to wrap it all up in a bow. Where is my argument? Where is my conclusion? Well, I've given you lots of arguments, hopefully, here, but where is my conclusion? You know, for many years, I was myself the prisoner of modernism and postmodernism, the box, I call it. You know, Jacques Derrida, the famous literary theorist, he was once at a seminar in Paris, and he was a postmodernist. And he was talking about the impossibility of removing oneself from modernist narratives, from the story. How do you get beyond the story? And a student put up their hand and they said, you know, Professor, it's a beautiful day outside, the sun is shining, it's summer, the grass is green, let's go outside and enjoy that instead of talking about this. And he replied, there is no outside. There is no outside of this story. And that's where I was stuck for decades, until I realized that the world had actually moved on, and it had been moving on quite happily without me and my theorizing, and that things were different, and that the stories were different. Maybe they're not stories anymore, I'm not sure. But the box suddenly seemed to be not the issue. Me thinking that there was a box was the issue. So, what is my ending? Today I stand here on the stage of our Wagner festival. And that's pretty much where I stopped writing. Because that's why we're here. This is, I think, actually what this festival is all about. This is why TUNDI exists, and I hesitate to say that in front of Hugh because this is his baby, but, you know. Certainly, that's why I'm president of the board, why I said yes when they asked me. Because TUNDI and the Wagner Festival is not here to give you an ending. You will see an ending. But it's one of many, 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 and it could go on for infinity. So yes, this could be about love, it could be about universal emotions, but ultimately, it's not about that. It's not about what we give you, it's about what we give you to think about and to take away with you. How you interpret yourself. This is not the end of history, but it's an opening for all of us. The fate web has been broken. The spear of law has been broken. The gods and the heroes are no more. What are you going to do? What do you think? What happens next? We've been given an opening, a space for a little moment when nobody is going to tell us what to do, what to think, how to be. And that allows us to think differently and to think otherwise. And most importantly, to think for ourselves. Thank you. Any questions? That's okay, because I did give you an ending of sorts. Hugh.
So, true to our last experience, I'm not sure it's quite in the category a question. Mm. So, I and we, TUNDI, have already performed Götterdämmerung once, and only once, right? It'll be the second time. And so I'm sort of interested in, so what happens past the ending, right? Which I think is like part of the inquiry that you are very open-endedly sort of offering for examination, yeah? And so what happens to me after, when Götterdämmerung is over? So people find their way, the ones who care to, they come backstage and they have something to say, or they talk to a cast member or myself in some other situations. And they certainly behave as though something as enormous as an ending has been given to them, right? Now, I'm not sure ending is the right word for the thing that they're responding for, and I don't impose my words, or indeed Wagner's words, or Wotan's words, das Ende. I don't impose that on anybody who comes to, of their own free will, offer a response. But people's response is enormous, enormous. It is in the category of an ending, the way people respond to, this one experience that we have had of actually performing They burst into tears, or they find themselves lost for a sort of normal vocabulary, a protocol vocabulary of congratulation, or indeed they want to talk about something that has nothing to do with the music, or they find memory summoned, personal memory. People literally have expressed to me, that they've had cathartic experiences around whatever type of trauma they might have had in their past, and by virtue of attending and then having the courage to share something about their response set to what they've attended, in this case with me, they really are expressing an exit, a process of exit or reconciliation or healing with trauma. I'm going to put that in the category ending. I know this isn't a little bit clumsy, but that's what comes up for me is about ending, is a set of unknowable and yet transformed results is what comes up. So, of course, I'm not asking you a question, but what do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know if you remember, but I think the first lecture I ever gave for you, we talked about Hellenic and Norse, but if you remember, I also talked about the relationship between epic and tragedy. And because to me, what you're describing is very much that kind of textbook notion of pity and fear leading to catharsis, right? Which, by the way, I think desperately needs to be problematized, much as the relationship between epic and tragedy should be. Ooh, that's a good topic good topic. So happy to talk about it. But those are emotional responses. But the burden of what you walk away with, if there is no such thing as a next step, and there is no such thing as a next, is also very interesting, right? We can talk about healing of trauma, but there is also the trauma of separation and the trauma of what happens next. I'm sorry, I'm thinking on my feet here, but I think that's the unknown bit, because the trouble is that if you write it, it's no longer part of that. You put it yourself back in another box, and I'm being really super thoughtful about that, because, as I said, I feel like I wasted a few decades trying to theorize my way out of that box, and so I'm not quite sure what to do with that next, except to talk about responsibility and free will. But the way that those stories have now gone is actually back to the notion of the local episteme, that we're falling back on individual and localized knowledge rather than trying to create these grand narratives. And, just riffing a little bit from what you said, I mean, you are also referring to our ongoing thirst for the grand narrative, for that great story, yes, for that great cycle, right? And that the ongoing need for healing through trauma. Sorry.
No, thank you.
Yes?
I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, so we'll figure it out by the time we get to the end. So Wagner was famously, involved in the revolutions of 1848 there, and where, most of Europe was trying to form some kind of new society and all of that, and obviously it failed at the time. And I'm just wondering if the failure for that revolution and some of the smaller ones that had erupted out of there and everything, even, the first festival was 1876, and that's only 5 years after the Paris Commune failed. here we are trying to do something, trying to make a new world, and it's not. I mean, in a sense, the revolution's always going on, and that sort of thing. I wonder if that somehow affected, how he came up with the ending. Because I have read, and I'm sure you can correct me if I'm wrong, that he had several endings kind of in mind, and sometimes like they were speaking Schopenhauer, and sometimes they were speaking, Marxism, or the idea of socialism, European socialism, or whatever. But then he just kind of left it for the music to kind of, all the transformations in the music and everything.
Yeah.
I just wonder if you think or can comment on how the historical forces of the time that he was in may have affected how he wrote the ending, and very also maybe famously, he doesn't bring it back full circle, because he doesn't end on the same chord that he starts off in Rheingold. Which as a ring cycle, you would think, oh, is he going to bring it all the way back around? And he ends it a little bit differently. He doesn't bring it back to the founding chord.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the weird thing, isn't it? Because I'm going to say it, I'm not sure it quite works, the whole thing, the whole ending, because it is so riven by all these different things that are occurring. Of course, I would always like to start from the point of view of it works, I just haven't realized how, right? But, that's always my first point. And so it's a sort of, in a way, it's an admission of failure to say, well, it doesn't work, does it? Because I haven't thought of how it works. But it does seem to me that it is very much a story that is very much, it's expressing so many deep complexities that I'm not sure where it leaves us. Which is why, by the way, because I haven't seen their performance yet. I'm coming in about an hour, so I'm very intrigued to see what they do with it. Because again, this is one of the joys of this festival, is it's so performer-driven that, in a way, the people who are in those characters are going to inhabit those characters and then see where it takes them, right, through the rehearsal and everything. So this is going to be something that is really very in the moment. So I love that. I'm very excited. So, and it's interesting that people are responding in this way. So I'm kind of, the future is definitely unknown for me. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to respond to it and how I'm going to rethink what I've just said to you. But I do certainly think that everything that you have just talked about is very much there in that kind of sense of series of conflicts that are set up within the cycle itself, things that don't make sense, things that have obviously been changed, but you're not quite sure why. And I even referred to the final chord as like, well, is it ironic? I mean, what are we talking about here? Redemption of love, when we've just seen Siegfried die and Brunhilde burn herself to death. I mean, what are we talking about? So it just feels like you've just left a whole bunch of people on the field feeling like, well, what do we do now, folks, right? So that's how it's always felt to me. But that's why I also very much linked it to that end of the century sort of movement into second wave modernism, which then leads to dystopias. To give you a really good example of this, in literature, it's often considered that the beginning of third wave modernism is the publication of The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which was only, 24 years after Die Gotte Dämmerung, which is you go on that journey, right? Just like Piers Plowman or Pilgrim's Progress or Dante going through Inferno to heaven, and what do you find at the center? You find the horror, right? So that is usually considered very much a kind of an evocation of that failure of second wave modernism, that failure of all that, of the idea, all the optimism around the nation state, the blowing up of capitalism, well, the presentation of that binary between capitalism and Marxism that really emerges so strongly in the 19th century, the revolutions that occur and don't seem to get anywhere. So then you end up with that, which is, and Schopenhauer's existential dread and Kierkegaard, and yeah. So yes, definitely, I think so. But
I get a request at this point you pointed out the hour and 20 plus
Yes.
the minute.
Okay.
So I would be grateful if, would you be willing to come off stage and engage with anybody who wants to
Sure.
engage further?
And then
Yeah.
I'm going to have a cup of coffee and
Yeah,
put
yeah.
something more comfortable on.
All right, okay, good. Yes, actually me too. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, pleasure. Thank you.